My guest today is Dani Rodrik. Dani is a professor of international political economy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. His research revolves around globalization, political economy, and economic growth and development. His current work focuses on how to create more inclusive societies in developed and developing economies. He recently received the Princesa Asturias Award for Social Sciences.
How do we know which are areas where we can go further, where we need global governance, which are areas where we don't need global governance and we need more individual rules? What are the key criteria that we should use to tell apart one from the other?
I think there are two sets of circumstances when the argument for global governance is very strong. One is when we're talking about a true global public good or a true global public bad that we want to avoid. So that's why I think the public health, pandemics, fighting pandemics, information sharing sessions, public health systems, because that's a true global public good, and I think that's where we need strong global governance regimes. The second huge big area of global public good, of course, is fighting climate change. So those are areas where there's a very strong argument, and what is critical about global public goods is that essentially that this is only can be provided through collaboration, because the interest of each individual nation is to free ride on the investments of other countries. So you want every other country to decarbonize, but you want to not impose any cost on your own industries. Now, the world economy is not a global public good in the sense that the benefits of pursuing open trade policies, of having good financial regulations, of having appropriate macroeconomic stability, the benefits are primarily domestic. So I think, unlike what many people believe, that there's a kind of analogy between the global commons in the area of climate change and the global commons in the area of economics. That's a very inappropriate analogy. And therefore, in many areas of economics, I think the global public good argument does not apply. And then we're better off leaving much greater leeway for countries to do what they want. There's one exception to this, and I'll just mention it. There's a sort of beggar thy neighbor policies, where the whole point of the policy is to derive some national benefits at the expense of other countries, like exercising monopoly power or harmful tax competition, when there's no way you're getting the investment. You just pay for corporations that are drawn in, and you're undercutting. So there are some economic areas where there's good arguments for global regulation as well. But most of the things that we negotiate in international trade agreements or international finance don't have that nature.
So let me throw one important spanner in the whole thinking about global governance. If we don't have a global hegemon, if we don't have somebody who actually can enforce without any enforcement mechanism, once the US becomes one more purely self-interested actor who doesn't really care about the world order, I mean, trade, all the ideas about the World Health Organization, the export restrictions on medical equipment, the constraints on sharing data, the rules on taxes, it's very difficult to enforce something that causes win-lose trade-offs, that somebody wins, somebody's going to lose even a little bit, without any police, without any enforcement. Can we really have any kind of globalization in the future without somebody who can make sure that people behave by the rules and not like the US did in the 3M imports of medical equipment, behave actually almost as a rogue actor?
As I was suggesting, I think in many economic areas, this is not an issue because, it's in a nation's own interest to pursue policies that are by and large to the benefit of everybody else. So if you are an economy, if you can manage your domestic social problems and your domestic distributional problems, then you do want to maintain a fairly openness to the rest of the world. So you do it because it's on your own interest, right? We teach, comparative advantage and the gains from trade. I mean, the reason that you want to, maintain open borders to goods and services is not that you want to confer benefits to your other countries. It's because you want to reap those gains from trade. Now, where you run into a problem is when you try to sign these, endless trade agreements, which and you don't do what's required to take care of the domestic economy, and then that becomes an unsustainable bargain because ultimately you get this backlash that people realize that what are we doing in this world economy? I mean, they've been telling us that globalization would lift all. It was a tide that would lift all boats, but we see a lot of people getting very wealthy and rich out of globalization, whereas we are sort of being really squeezed here. And the middle class has been squeezed in a lot of countries because of the consequences of globalization. So I think there are areas where, and you're absolutely right, that the only way you can maintain cooperation in those areas where it's really critical is through sort of slowly building trust and reputation and sort of saying that, you want to do this because in the long run, it's to everybody's interest. But I think it's a false dilemma for many economic areas, because I think the lesson of the Bretton Woods era, for example, where the international disciplines were very, very weak, right? GATT was not worth the paper it was written on in terms of its enforcement power. Yet we got huge amounts of trade liberalization. Why? Because countries were doing the right thing domestically. They were growing with inclusion and equity. And when countries are doing well, they're much more likely to condone opening up to the rest of the world. So the best thing we can actually do for the world economy and for globalization is actually allowing countries to solve their domestic problems. And that's, I think, where we are.
But in some of those other areas you mentioned, cooperation is important. Climate, health, tax havens, health, pandemics in particular. It does seem like at a particular time, cooperation is always going to break down because there's always going to be somebody who's interested and who's powerful and who can, at least in their own interest, not follow those rules. So there is where, I fear that, yes, we all kind of see those gains. Even the European Union, where we have strong institutions, we can't really ensure that certain countries don't free ride without some sort of coercive power of some kind.
No, that is the dilemma of international relations. As you said, there is no enforcer, and so you need to rely on, self-enforcing agreements, and that's it requires sort of building trust and investing in reputation and it helps to have larger nations sort of demonstrate that they're willing to do what it takes. And I think and when you don't have the largest countries in the world doing that, and certainly the Trump administration has been a terrible example of this,
yeah.
Or where you're in a kind of a transitional point in history where one power is in decline, another one is rising, such as in the context of U.S.-China relations. So it becomes much harder to maintain that that cooperation. But I want to come back and really say that I think the biggest problem we face is not lack of global cooperation or the absence of global governance. The biggest problem we have now is lousy domestic governance. And I'm willing to bet anything that where we will see the action that really matters, even we've seen it in with respect to the COVID-19, but I think even in climate change, I think eventually it's going to be domestic action that's going to fix things. Even though the economic logic is why should the EU have decarbonization policies? Why should California declare itself sort of a carbon-free zone for cars? It makes no sense. But I think it's basically you have political action and political community at the level of much smaller jurisdictions, and that's where you're going to get the action. And so our challenge is to really fix local and national governance.
So let's turn to that.